Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 61 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and over 300 organizational partners from all over the world have convened a 2-hour open space between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time so that people from all over the world can come together and share their experiences of how it is happening for them as we all navigate our way through this extraordinary pandemic. As we all know, we're in a crisis that began about 5 months ago and doesn't at this point show any signs of lessening. In the last week, the World Health Organization has said that the world has now had over 11 million cases and over 250,000 going on 300,000 deaths. The United States continues to set daily records for the number of coronavirus cases. There's been massive unrest in various cities around the world. Governments are continuing to struggle for how do we, 8 billion people all over the world, how do we navigate through a microbe, the effects of a microbe? We've all been engaging in social distancing. All of us are still under some form of lockdown. US citizens aren't allowed to fly to Europe for the first time in history. Airports are closed. And the net effect of all this is to really put the world not only in the same conversation, but in a deep deliberative process. So Humanity Rising has tried to use the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity for as deep a dialogue as we can convene around 3 core issues. Number 1, strategies for change, as we're calling it. How do we increase our strategic effectiveness so that we can actually make a difference in the post-pandemic world? Secondly, what we're calling new mindsets for a new world. What are the new levels of consciousness? What are the new storylines that we can develop? Humanity clearly needs a new story. How can we develop that? What would a global story look like that humanity would unanimously embrace? And then thirdly, solutions that are making a difference. How do we actually implement on the ground solutions that can make a difference, ideally at scale? Today, we're going to take up arguably the most sacred trust society has. And that is, how do we raise our young? Every culture in the world, since time began, something we actually inherited from the upper primates and the evolutionary order of life way before humans. Life forms guarantee survival by how they bring up their young. Extraordinary. Trust to ensure the transgenerational memory of how one survives, how one adapts, and how one lives in harmony with one's peers in a social structure and ideally with the environment. Today, education is challenged as never before. Up until the current generation, there was some sense of normalcy, even in revolutionary times. There was a certain way of being in the world. But in the last 20 or 30 years, we've been experiencing, actually the last 50 years, what scientists are calling the Great Acceleration. Human knowledge now, today, is doubling every 12 and a half minutes. By the time we finish this broadcast, human knowledge will have doubled probably a half a dozen times. That's how fast reality, just in terms of knowledge, is exploding. 2/3 of the jobs 10, 15 years ago do not exist today. And 2/3 of the jobs that exist today won't exist in 10 to 15 years. That's how fast the economy is shape-shifting. An IBM study in 2010, done with 1,700 CEOs and 3,600 students from all over the world, 60 countries around the world, concluded that there was not a single institution of higher education, not Harvard, not Oxford, not the University of Beijing, that is preparing young people to successfully navigate through what it called hypercomplexity. What today we call VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. In a global system where small events anywhere can ricochet through the global system and have major effects everywhere. That's just happened with the pandemic. A little virus in Wuhan, China, ricocheted through the system and shut the world down. What's next? Because there's going to be a next. Climate change is spinning out of control. Species are being exterminated at a record number. All the major indicators are getting worse, not better. And in the midst of this, we've got to educate our young people and learners of all ages. How do we do that? That's the subject we want to turn to today. As an educator, as the president of a university, I must say this subject is very dear to my heart because we at Ubiquity live this. How do you prepare courses? How do you prepare experiences that are going to give the emerging generation the mindsets, the skill sets, the tool sets, not only to navigate hypercomplexity and a VUCA world, but how to come together and solve the global problems which are spinning out of control in a diminishing time frame. The challenges to education could not be more immense. So I'm delighted today to have the pleasure of introducing our panel. Stephanie Pace Marshall, who is a very old friend and colleague. She was on the founding board of Ubiquity University, wrote a book on transformational learning back in the 1990s that I read a number of times and sent out to all my friends and colleagues. Before that, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, she was the founder and CEO of the Illinois Math and Science Academy that applied transformational learning practices to science and technology. And so she'll be speaking with us. She's now on our board of advisors. Patrick Walker, who's a newer friend, but a brilliant mind and a dynamic personality, who's one of the co-founders and CEO of Uptime, an innovative company dealing with information and media. And it was with Patrick that we came up with the idea to do this panel, actually. And then we have Lucretia Bisignani, who is the founder and CEO of KUKOA, a company that is developing a franchise of children's educational centers called Super Sigma. So we have 3 educators, people that are passionate about learning, who are going to address the very specific issue of how do we develop education in a world full of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we'll start with Stephanie, then we'll hear from Patrick, and then Lucretia, and then when they're done, we'll have a dialogue between us. And then, as we've done every day, those of you who want to ask a question or make a comment, do so in the chats. We'll all be tracking the chats, and I'll bring in whatever it is that you guys want to be addressed as we go along. So thank you, everyone. Stephanie, we'll start with you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. It's a joy to see you as always, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you're here. It is such a privilege to be a part of this conversation. Humanity Rising is not only a remarkable dialogue that has been created, as Jim says, for 61 days now, but it's actually a opportunity for us to catalyze change over time. Because the question is, how does humanity actually rise in terms of collective moral action at this unprecedented moment? And this all goes back to what Jim said in terms of the grounding in this sacred trust of what does that mean for the education of our young people. So I am going to, we have already been situated in an environment of VUCA, and Jim has named that. That we know that's a true description because we experience the whiplash of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity every day. So we know that that's an accurate description, but I want to situate us in another context besides VUCA. And that is the inextricable relationship between the future of learning and the future of humanity. Jim said it beautifully in his introduction, that there is a sacred trust. There is a remarkable responsibility we have in terms of how we are educating the minds, the hearts, the souls, the spirits of our children. I had the opportunity, brief story, to be at a TED Talk not too long ago with a photojournalist who was renowned for the remarkable pictures that he took in war-torn regions. He would go to places that no one else would go, tsunamis and tornadoes, but he also captured the astonishing pictures and tragedies of war. And when he was finished, he opened it up to questions, and there was someone in the audience that said, what's the secret to taking a great photograph? And he paused for a moment and he said, well, technique is very important, but the secret is knowing where to point the camera. Well, I can't emphasize this construct enough for us in this conversation that we're going to have today and far beyond, because as members of the Ubiquity community, the Humanity Rising community, we have the opportunity now to point the camera in a very different place. In places we are not used to noticing and seeing, at voices we are not used to hearing, at evidence we are not used to measuring and assessing, at conditions we are not used to celebrating. We have to illuminate what is currently unseen because it has profound influence on who we become. And just because something is not seen doesn't mean it isn't there, doesn't mean it is not palpable, doesn't mean that it doesn't permeate and influence. It doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to move. It only moves silently, and it moves beneath the radar until it erupts, and then we are stunned and we wonder where it came from. And this is precisely where we are now, and it has enormous implications for the future of learning and the future of schooling. So I'm going to point the camera at how I think about the highest altitude of this conversation on the transformation of learning. And again, as Jim said, I'm going to be talking about what I call a new story of learning. Because if we don't change the story, we won't change its map. If we don't change the map of learning, we will not change the landscape, design, and the systems of learning. And if we don't change those, we will never change the experiences and the choices our children have to make. And if we don't change their experiences and choices, we will never give them the opportunity to both shape and create their own minds. And the reason this is so fundamental, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is because mind shaping is world shaping. I'm probably going to say this many times, and if you're inclined to draw a bumper sticker or a refrigerator magnet, you may think about that too. Mind shaping is world shaping. How we are taught to think, what we are taught and required to think about shapes who we become, and who we become shapes our world. So the new story of learning and the context of our conversation today is fundamentally about who do we now choose to be for this time, and who do we want our children to become in order that they can create a just and sustainable and flourishing future for all, and then how we help design to bring it to life. You have no doubt heard people refer to this moment many times as a kairos moment, not a chronos moment. It is that too, of course, in chronological time. But a kairos moment is a moment of indeterminate time, a moment that invites the emergence of deep knowing without the constraints of prescribed or predetermined boundaries. And although the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous time we are in is there, kairos time brims with possibility. And our possibility now is to create and live into this new story of learning and schooling that is generative and life-affirming, and what I'm calling naturally right by design. For decades, children have been living a toxic narrative of who they are as learners. I'm not smart enough. I can't do math. Someone's smarter than me. My father couldn't do math either, so it's hereditary. Whatever the narrative is, our kids have become schooling disabled in a learning abundant universe. Schooling has become what I call a vehicle for identity theft. Children have been robbed of the very essence of knowing who they are and how astonishing their gifts are. So knowing what we now know, we simply cannot keep doing what we now do. It really is malpractice from my perspective. And so we're at a very critical point. We've been here for quite some time. Again, as Jim said, decades and decades. But this really does feel like a kairos and a sacred moment. We have to come to terms. Who do we choose to be now? And how can we create conditions with intention and by design and with fidelity that will allow our children to live into their astonishing potential? So the story that I'm framing, and it's not really me, this is putting together lots and lots of thinking over many years of many profoundly thoughtful people. How do we design a narrative that can lead to the transformation of human consciousness, that can liberate the goodness and genius within every child, and that can nurture what I'm calling decidedly different both and minds, minds that are integral, wise, global minds that will creatively live into a new worldview of an interconnected and living planet and a thriving and interdependent living story. These are, again, I mentioned both and minds. So we're connecting this integrative power of knowing, which does not happen in places currently called schools. We're connecting the intellect and the imagination, knowledge and relationships, research, hypothesis testing, experimental design, and prototyping, simulation, problem solving, and storytelling. We're giving kids opportunities to immerse themselves in observation and evidence-based truth, and improvisation and experiential truth, in analytical measurement and aesthetic insight, in reason and compassion and empathy, in curiosity and skepticism and wonder and awe, and in expertise and wisdom and love. This is where we must point the camera. Mind shaping is world shaping, and it matters profoundly how our minds are shaped, because narrative trumps data every time. We live in narratives, but they're invisible to us, and we don't recognize that we are living within a narrative. And the power of story is asymmetrical to the actual information that it frames, but we walk our embedded stories without knowing it, and then we become them. Parker Palmer is well known in the field of education, and he said something I think that's really important. Every way of knowing becomes a way of living. Every epistemology becomes an ethic. Every mode of education, no matter what its name, is a mode of soul making. So we know that our genius lies not in predicting the future. We can do that. We can't do that, but it resides in imagining and creating the future. It is the nature and quality of our thinking that shapes who we become, and who we become shapes the world. I have held a question all my professional life, and Jim referred to a book I wrote in 2006. And here was the question that I responded to. I didn't answer it because I don't have answers for most things. I have responses for most everything, but not answers. So here was the question. What will it take to create a generative and life-affirming system of learning and schooling that liberates the goodness and genius of every child and ignites and nurtures the power and creativity of the human spirit for the world? And my response, after a lot of research and experience and working in many, many, many institutions, it will take a new story. It will take a new map, and it will take a new landscape of learning and schooling by design. This means reimagining, redesigning the conditions for generative and life-affirming learning that enables every child to thrive, and it means designing human systems with life as our mentor and living systems as our model. You are no doubt familiar with the work of Yuval Noah Harari, his most recent book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He says the following at the intro to his book: humankind is facing unprecedented revolutions. All our old stories are crumbling, and no new story has so far emerged to replace them. How can we prepare ourselves and our children for a world of such unprecedented transformations and radical uncertainties? What should we teach and help them or her to survive and flourish in the 22nd century? This is our question. What will it take? What should we teach? And how should we prepare them so they can develop their minds well? I want to close with a story. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to speak to a global conference at Kellogg, the Northwestern School of Business at Northwestern University, about the current conditions, the current narrative of learning, and what we need for the future. And they situated it again, as we have situated it for our conversation today, in volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity. And I wanted to deal with that to honor their predisposition, but also to point the camera in a different place. And it was difficult to get their attention because they were looking at schooling and learning through a very, very contemporary narrative, the old story. So I said to them, I'm going to just play along with me for a minute, because I want to have you imagine, what if we were going to put an ad in the newspaper inviting children to the schools we now have. I have written that ad, and I'd like to read it to you, but then I have written another ad. I have written an ad for the schools we want to invite our children to. So see if when I read these ads to you, you are capturing the discerning difference between the current story we are in, which I call the old story, and the new story. And I modeled the ad along the lines of the ad that was placed by Sir Ernest Shackleton in 1914, when he allegedly put an ad in a paper in London advertising for people to accompany him on his expedition to Antarctica in 1914. And his ad was very short. It said, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." So I took that model, and here's my invitation to students, to the schools we currently have, and to the educational narrative we currently have. Students wanted good test takers, compliant rule followers, and risk-averse learners, aspiring to high GPAs and willing to accept illusions of proficiency and false proxies for learning, willing to sacrifice autonomy, engagement, meaning, and the passionate pursuit of what you love for uniformity and the safety of predictability. Prescribed and structured journey with clear proficiency and accountability standards, ability grouping and benchmarks. Expect to comply, do what is required, and progress from grade to grade with little freedom and constant supervision. Duties not demanding, work not challenging, engagement in meaningful real-world problem solving deferred. The opportunity to graduate when you finish your required seat time is up to you. And here's the ad I would love us to put in every paper, not only in America, but around the world. Wanted next generation global leaders, innovators and designers, change makers, problem solvers with dazzling potentials, lively intellectual curiosity, unabashed creativity, optimism, and a commitment to learning and contribution. Unparalleled journey with friends, mentors, and fellow collaborators. Unique opportunities to create, imagine, invent, and dream by day, and without apology. Expect to explore unknown and uncertain territory, play, take risks, improvise, and act with conviction and courage. Duties demanding, work challenging, inconvenient questions welcome. Repeated failure comes with the territory. A supportive team ever present. The opportunity to shape the future now, priceless. Thank you.
If we had the fund, Stephanie, I'd run your ad in the New York Times. I mean, given that choice, I want to sign up for the second one.
Oh, good. You're a fast learner, Jim Garrison. Well, they actually got it. When they listened to it, I think they were sort of just they're stunned. They said, "Okay, we get it. Good, okay."
But it's so true, everyone. I mean, isn't it? I mean, I went to the top of the best schools in the Western world, and it's just like that first ad that she read. There's no difference between the elites and the marginal schools. It's all been done the same, and it's been done the same for a couple thousand years.
Oh yeah.
We really haven't changed education since the Han Dynasty, in ancient China.
But it manifests, I mean, sadly it manifests, and we've seen this in the last year, of parents, cutting off the heads of their kids, putting the heads on the body of a swimmer and trying to get them into Harvard, because that's the old story. That's the way you succeed. And that's the tragedy for the children.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly.
To be continued.
Yeah. And that's worth just noting. We probably may get to it in the dialogue, but the casualty rate among students in the existing system in terms of depression,
Right.
drug abuse, suicides, all kinds of maladjustments, maladies of all kinds, is rampant, and not just in the West, but in the East, North, and the South. It's quite an extraordinary price our children are paying for an educational system that no longer works. So now, Patrick, what do you have to say on this vast subject?
Wow, tough act to follow. Thank you for the intro, and thank you, Stephanie, for that wonderful opening of this dialogue. Stephanie and I met for the first time last week, and it's quite fascinating. I have a very, very different background, but we come to some very similar conclusions through very different routes. So just a little bit about myself. I'm based in London. I grew up in the US, but I've lived most of my life outside the US, in Japan and Thailand, and most recently for the last 20 years in Europe, and currently calling in from Lisbon, Portugal. I have been very much focused throughout my entire career on the sort of intersection between technology and storytelling. And I began my career having studied journalism and education and technology as a children's television producer in Japan, actually, with NHK, the national public broadcaster there, trying to find ways through media to transmit knowledge in a fun and interesting way. Eventually found myself working on the launch of the first high definition TV channel, always looking for the newest technology to transmit knowledge and information in an interesting, compelling way. I then worked for the BBC as a foreign news journalist, using technology to tell stories from often hostile VUCA environments, which was a fascinating process. How do you condense a very complex narrative from, say, East Timor, or the collapse of the Khmer Rouge into a 3-minute story? How do you transmit a version of the truth that can stand up? But eventually, interestingly, found my way back to Europe and got involved early in these short form, internet-based content services. I was the first international employee for YouTube, and had the honor of launching YouTube in 60 so countries in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And what was exciting about working for Google and YouTube at the time was, it felt almost like a public service entity, organizing the world's information and democratization of media, and anyone in the world having a voice, and the role that these platforms played in things like, the Green Revolution in Iran and the attempts at democracy across the Middle East. Both social platforms and these video platforms gave people a voice. I found my way after some entrepreneurial work to Facebook, and worked for 3 years launching video services for Facebook and Instagram, including Facebook Watch, and involved in IGTV. And this was a wonderful experience, but I started to ask myself the question on a personal level. At the end of the day, personally, particularly as somebody who stands in front of large audiences and talks about the mission and the purpose of these platforms, which I believe, is what we're doing on these platforms always net positive for the audience? Is it that somebody's unfettered use of a social platform is necessarily going to lead to positive outcomes? Or are there things happening based on the models or the scale that they've now achieved that are perhaps harmful even to individuals or society? And I don't answer that question, but I asked myself the question whether every day everything I did had a net positive output, and I was not sure. And so I thought to myself, perhaps I need to step back and go back to my roots in education and learning. I had a real longing to go back to doing things that were of high intent and focused on care for the information being transmitted. I have a lot of respect for these major platforms and the work that they're doing, but there are a number of things that were starting to concern me. I didn't want to be directly involved in terms of, sort of the attention and cognition issues by overuse of social platforms, making sense of the world, misinformation and conspiracy theories, fake news being spread in many ways, and a lot of work being done to control it, but very hard to fight against it. Questions around physical and mental health and well-being, the effect on our social relationships of these platforms. These are things that don't define the platforms, but they're questions we all need to ask ourselves as parents, as individuals, as users of these platforms. What are we doing as individuals and as a society to make sure we're educating people in the right way, that they don't become the window on the world at the expense of perhaps things that people should learn in a more healthy environment that can help them lead to a more happy, sustainable life. And so I said, okay, I'm going to step away from these large platforms and focus on something to do with media, but also learning. And I thought I should start by just asking myself a key question. And that question I came up with was, in an ideal world, what would be considered a safe and viable learning environment for a better future for humanity and the environment? And I did some work with a number of people around the world, and I spent some time with some other really fascinating thinkers. And we came up with a couple ideas. One of the things that we thought about was, well, if you look at approaching learning for the world that we deserve, that we need, by just going towards the existing education system, like Stephanie said, you have a lot of challenges because the schools themselves are designed with outcomes that are more focused on economic output, employability, test scores that aren't necessarily based on creative thinking and helping people adapt and learn how to work effectively and live a sustainable life in an uncertain world. I also spent a lot of time reading Dr. Harari's work, and I looked at some of the older, greats and those thinkers, like even Charles Darwin, who said it's not the strongest of the species that survive, but nor the most intelligent, but those most adaptable to change. And so I thought to myself, okay, for me personally, with my background in media and technology, I want to approach this perspective from a media and technology approach, and in a way find like-minded people to do an end game, if you like, around the education system, to go directly to people with some sort of moonshot, collectively with others, to find ways to inspire people to learn and grow and contribute to a better world, perhaps more organically, and also importantly, meeting people where they are. For those people that have dropped out of the system, I think only 69% of people graduate from high school in the US, right? And a smaller number from university. So once you're outside the system, what are the channels through which you can reach people with great knowledge content? The internet, of course, is a very important one. But you're going against a headwind of a lot of content that maybe it is interesting or entertaining, but it is also like a bit of sugar rush, unhealthy material for the mind. So how can we start to look at content that is really about inspiring personal growth and positive change? And so I also thought anything I do going forward, and I would encourage everyone to think this way as well, is what is the generative principle of the work that you're doing? And for me, the word that really stood out was the word care. And care for self, care for others, and care for the world around us. And what I found through my research was that actually care-based systems have been around for tens of thousands of years with indigenous communities worldwide that basically live their lives on that principle: care for oneself, care for others, and care for the world. Now, we on a daily basis tend to think that we're doing that. But if you actually map that against the things you consume, the way in which you treat others, the long-term effects of our behavior, it isn't necessarily the case that what we care for, we're treating in a way that actually has the most potential for positive long-term outcomes. So I thought a care-based platform for learning would be a great place to go. So that's what I'm really focused on now with Uptime. And it's a short-form video-based learning platform. We're working with lots of different knowledge organizations around the world, authors and experts, to find ways to inspire people to learn through short-form video. It's just a small piece of a very large attempt that many other people are doing to use technology, to use inspirational speakers and authors to tap into some great knowledge that would inspire people using the tips and the tools and the tricks that have been established, if you like, by large technology companies, but with that word care at the center of it. And so that's really, my story and what I'm focused on. And it's an honor to be part of this dialogue. I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you, Patrick. You're opening up a profound and unprecedented new subject. How do we transmit learning on social media?
Yeah.
This little iPhone we all have, we carry around, our smartphones, is only since 2007. I mean, if you think about it, we take it completely for granted. It dominates the world, and we've had it for less than 20 years. So this issue of how young people are learning has been radically transformed by our technology. So, you're raising an issue, Patrick, that is huge.
Well, not just technology. Technology isn't a bad thing. It's like a tool that can be used. It's like the axe maker's dilemma, right? It can be used to destroy or to build. But the problem that we have now is it's not just neutral technology. It's technology that is designed to capture your attention, designed to attract you with perfectly designed colors and buttons and notifications that are very appealing. And so you may have had this experience where you go on to a notification on your phone and you open something up to specifically respond or take a look at something that might be a wonderful picture of your sister's baby, but an hour later you're almost drooling, mindlessly scrolling through content that was not your intention, but you've been hoodwinked a little bit. And so you're working with technology that is wonderful, it's powerful, but it's also so appealing that it could in fact lead to, in many ways, dumbing down of a person's own approach to life and of society in the worst case scenarios.
Yeah. Well, we'll circle back to this in the discussion because this is a huge new frontier. So let's turn to Lucretia. Lucretia, welcome. Tell us something about yourself and your background and this audacious project you've got going for a franchise for childhood learning.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here, and I was really inspired by all the conversations from Patrick and Stephanie in your introduction, Jim. I'm currently calling in from Nairobi, Kenya, which is where I'm based and live. Education is such a big word. I think over the years and the history, it has taken all sorts of connotations and meanings, and it has been institutionalized a lot. So I like to think of it more as learning, which is at the heart of what education is. And I like to think as my life as a set of learning experiences. And every time I talk about my background, it's all really a set of learning experiences that has brought me to where I am. I've had a very informal learning path, starting, from a very young age, having fabulous parents who inspired me with great stories. I'm Italian, so I had a very Italian upbringing with beautiful stories, and that, that always made my childhood playful and imaginative. I was also very lucky to travel a lot and visit Africa and other places, especially rural areas and places that were very different from where I was growing up. And that really opened up my eyes to, a whole new dimension and different places, different cultures. I learned, however, that at heart we were all the same, and the beauty of the world and the cultures lied in the differences. And I then went on to study acting because theater was one of my big passions. And above everything, acting taught me a lot about how to be vulnerable and courageous and brave enough to show yourself for who you are. And then I went on to I moved to San Francisco. I spent some time there, and I spent 3 months in this place called Singularity University, which is not a university, but it's this amazing 3 months program inside of NASA where you are surrounded by amazing entrepreneurs and technologists, and you study exponential technologies applied to global challenges, and that's what really pushed my thinking to moonshot thinking and how can I have a positive impact on 1 billion people in 10 years using exponential technologies. And that's where I started my journey with the company that I'm currently building, Kukua, which is an edutainment company. We're literally blurring the worlds of education and entertainment to create engaging and empowering experiences, content, games, and toys for children. So we're focused on preschoolers. And we are creating the first African edutainment franchise around a set of African characters, superhero characters. The whole franchise is called Super Sema. It started with a set of game-based learning apps that teach children literacy and numeracy through games, following the adventures of Super Sema, our main hero. And it is now expanding into an animated series that inspires kids to STEM, and it's full of 21st century skills. The whole world we're creating around the characters is an Afrofuturistic, aspirational world. It's set in Africa. It's the story of Super Sema, this young 10-year-old girl who is a superhero, but her powers are not magical. Her powers are her creativity, her imagination, and the use of STEM. And she has a secret lab, a STEM laboratory over her house with 5 distinct STEAM stations, where she invents all sorts of crazy, cool inventions to fight back this AI robot who's making the lives of the village miserable. So she's a little bit the Greta Thunberg and child hero, standing up to kind of the status quo and really taking on the problems of the village and her community on her shoulders. I believe that the current generation of children growing up are the alpha generation. So all the kids from 0 to 7-year-olds old are per se superheroes. They are growing up incredibly tech savvy in the 21st century. Really, technology is at their fingertips, and they are going to be the ones who are going to take on the biggest challenges and problems in the world, using technology, using empathy, using an understanding and love for humanity and the planet. And through this show, we wanted to inspire them to with great characters and stories, that they too can have the confidence to go on and create fantastic solutions for this world. It's all set in Africa. It's one of the first shows that has an entirely Black cast. Our team behind it is also mainly female, from Africa and all over the world. And it's one of the first few franchises that has been built this way. I think right now, with the whole Black Lives Matters movement, it has come to a priority, and it has never been as important to show representation and diversity on screen, so that kids can identify with not only kids that they look alike and resonate with, if they're also African American or African, but also for kids all over the world to understand that diversity is beautiful, and for them to grow up with a global mindset and love for the rest of the world. So yeah, this is what we're creating. I'm a strong believer that stories and characters really change and reaffirm how kids see themselves in the world, and it is important for them to get inspired by the time they spend out of school and online, watching entertaining and fun and playful videos or games or activities. So really, for me, one of the most important things is to make that time matter. If they're online, how can we, I've seen kids being completely captured by shows like Peppa Pig and really drawn into the storytelling. And I always thought, if only, we could have a show that's as funny and adventurous and wonderful and engaging, but really leaves kids with a strong message and a learning that they can then bring into the world and can, spark curiosity and imagination for something else. So this is the show we are creating. This is the values of the company we are building, and we hope to translate that also across toys. So every episode we've built so that it can have a STEM kit associated with the episode, and they can go on and build something in real life from what they've seen and learned in the show. And I'm looking forward to discussing more with all of you, kind of this intersection of education and play and informal learning, and even how we can bring that into classrooms.
Well, thank you, Lucretia. What you're doing is cutting edge, because I think one of the effects of the recent acceleration in technology is really to blur categories. It's what social media has done. Education is becoming entertainment, and ideally entertainment will become education, as students have shorter attention spans, need to get all kinds of different modular ways of learning, but in a way that is tailored to a new generation that is used to an internet and web. Their lives on the web are as real as their lives in their homes. And how we use that is a critical challenge. So thank you all. Let me start the dialogue, because I want to circle back to the title of Transformational Learning in a World Characterized by Volatility, Uncertainty, Complexity, and Ambiguity. I'd like to hear from each of you as to what that means for you as an educator. How does volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, what the folks at IBM called hypercomplexity, how is that affecting this emerging generation, and how do we reshape learning to enable people to actually navigate through a world that's getting more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, and more ambiguous? On a panel just yesterday, a guy named Bob Stilger was making the point that there's no more normal. He says, we keep talking about the new normal. He says, that's just because we can't be imaginative enough. There's no more normal. There's just the new now, he said. And that now can last a week, it can last a year, it can last 3 minutes. That's VUCA.
Right.
And so just offer it out there. How is this new world of hypercomplexity affecting education, and how do each of you think we need to, what would be the priorities that you would offer for young people growing up in this kind of a world?
Well, I'll just jump into the first part. The first part of the question is far easier than the second part.
Stephanie, you ought to put your video on.
Oh, sorry.
You can find it.
Yeah, can you see it now?
There we go. There we go.
Okay. The first part of your question is a bit easier than the second part of your question. First part is, kind of what do we know? The second part is what are we going to do? So I'm just going to read a list of words. And when you said, how do we think about the environment of volatility, et cetera, I'm just going to read you language that is the current mindset of the design of most schools, not every. Of course, I'm not making a blanket statement of everything. And just listen to the language, because therein lies, it is so entrenched, so part of this system that we're Okay, so here's the language of where kids will come into places called schools. Prescription, memory, answers, transmission, compliance, certainty, acquisition, uniformity, competition, individualism, threat, fear. Now I'll read language that is part of the VUCA environment. Purpose, meaning, questions, engagement, inquiry, curiosity, exploration, personalization, interdependence, collaboration, challenge, trust, and joy. So that the VUCA environment requires, in order to navigate in it without wanting to jump off a bridge because you are clueless, that mindset of the second one I read needs to be something that the kids, it's the air they have to breathe, and they do not breathe that. And I'm making a generalization again, in places called schools, because the system is so inextricably woven into this narrative that is not a true story of who we are as human beings, of our dazzling potentials, of who we are when we are together. So many things. So it is, you need to, the system is alive, so we can enter at any place. There's no prescription where we can enter. And it's putting new behaviors, concepts, mindsets, heart sets in motion. And I would say we start with what's in front of us with children and what's real in terms of the problems that they are living in, and engaging them in unpacking the constructs of the problem and how to solve it. Because if we don't engage them actively in the currency of where they are, then school is even less connected to their lives than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things,
what would you say?
yeah, I mean, one of the things that concerns me a lot is that, if you have this system that is focused on success based on exam results, and therefore entry into a certain tiering of universities, right, entering into certain tiering of employment with certain tiering of, economic opportunity, the incentives are useful perhaps in a sort of industrial environment, but they're not for the VUCA world that we need, right? We need a diversity of thinking. We need everyone to feel empowered. We need to inspire people to remain curious constantly, to be lifelong learners, for them to stay relevant. And if you read, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Dr. Yuval Harari, the summary of that book is basically know thyself, right? So don't look externally for those solutions, but find time to get to know your own self, because the technology is going to know you better than you know yourself very, very soon if it doesn't already. And so we need to teach people how to defend themselves against addictive tech. We need to teach people how to connect with areas of interest naturally, organically, and in an interesting way, whether that be through media or whether that be through schools that can perhaps allow people to be uniquely themselves and understand that everyone has some sort of inner genius that can only be, if it can only be unlocked, we would get a lot more incredible diverse thinking to solve the problems that we're going to be facing. I mean, I think Einstein said if you expected a fish to climb a tree, he'd spend his life thinking he was stupid. So how do we unlock this inner genius? How do we create a system, whether that be through media? How do we create platforms? How do we create schools and environments where everyone has an opportunity through an inspirational approach to teaching and learning, where that genius can come through? I think that's particularly important, coupled with defensive arts against addictive tech, and defensive arts against this, headwinds of advertising, consumerism, platforms that are built solely for the purpose for profit, and therefore this attention economy play is the prime directive, right? We need to focus on optimizing for people's minds, not for their time. And unfortunately, most of the platforms out there today for no faults of their own, based on the need to drive this quarterly profit, focus on time, because time equals money in an advertising-driven world. So how can we create systems, solutions that are perhaps not ad-based, that are more subscription-based or funded in different ways that you don't have that time imperative, so people can learn at their own pace? The exchange of value is not determined by amount of time spent. I think that's another thing that we need to think about as we look for platforms of the future. So that's what crosses my mind, is unlocking individual genius and creativity, and understanding technology enough you can defend against these headwinds that keep you from actually learning the things you need to know to live a happy, sustainable life.
And just, if I may, just to jump off on what Patrick just said, I know you can, through technology and the sophistication that you have brought and the wise thinking, create communities for very complex created problem solving. And so it's, people talk a lot about project-based learning and problem-based learning. They're profoundly different. And my focus in the institution that I founded years ago is problem-based learning. How can we X in such a way that, which is the value piece of a problem. So it's not how can we solve gun violence, it's how can we solve whatever it is in such a way that people are honored, empathetic. I mean, just list the values that you have. That can be done in a sophisticated technology platform where communities of kids, intergenerational for that matter, can come together in the solution while they are also bringing their curiosity, bringing their imagination, bringing their heart, bringing their empathy, bringing their questions, listening to one another. I mean, in a real problem where it's framed by the values that we hold dear, the mindset can shift over time because that's what you practice. You have to practice those things to solve the problem.
Good point. Lucretia, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think one of the most important aspects for learning, really from when you're a child all the way up, is really to instill a love for learning and a curiosity to learn. And I think many education systems around the world forget that and make learning boring, or we have kids growing up not seeing the broader sense of why they are learning that and why it is important for them as humans and people and in society and in the world. So if we can try to really give kids and anyone the broader understanding of why they need to learn what they need to learn, and make it come from a place of love and something they're passionate about, then they will always look for opportunities to learn, even if such as now they are out of school. So in the Nordics, which have an amazing education system, a lot of the curriculum is driven through things that kids care about or are passionate about. So they'll, if you have a kid who is passionate about cooking, they'll use the recipe of a cake to teach math and addition and all these, and creativity and teamwork and all these different things. And that shows you like why math is important, or why these other things and why you need them, because you're making it very practical and useful, and the kids are just focused on something they love. And in this way, even in uncertain times where, for example, now all kids are out of school, you will find opportunities to learn through everyday activities. And as I said, that's how I learned. I never went to formal university, but I learned every single thing that I had to learn to build a company. And every day I'm learning something new by doing it, even if I'm not in a physical institutional place. Now, I understand that's not how everyone learns, and some people need that. And it opens up a whole new problem of, kids being at home and parents working, and there's no one really there to assist in that learning. So of course that needs to be addressed. And for that, I think the best way to look at it is, instead of focusing on kind of the problem that we have right right now at this moment, and how do we solve it? So there's a pandemic. How, do we get kids back to school? I think this is more an example of what the rest of the next few years will be like. Things are changing so quickly, as you said, constantly. So this is just a dress rehearsal. Next year, there will be something else. The point is, the system is outdated, and I wouldn't spend my time trying to solve the problem that we're facing right now, but I would try to find a way for which we can constantly update the system to keep relevant for anything that happens. In 20 years, we might have robots taking over the world. Who knows? We must be ready for that. And we must create a system that constantly updates so that, we are preparing kids for a world that still exists and not for one that was existing years ago. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Lucretia. I mean, that last point, I think, is seminal. If you look at most educational systems, they're drawn from the past. Mm-hmm. And what you just said and what Stephanie's been saying is you got to create the learning system from the future.
Right.
Because the past no longer exists, ladies and gentlemen. We are now moving at hyperspeed into hypercomplexity, and it's ready or not, here we come, and there's no more any neutral ground. And the one thing, by the way, I would just add to this conversation is the importance of soft skills. Every single study, without exception, that I know about anyway, starting with that IBM study in 2010, when the IBM folks asked the question, so what are the skill sets that young people need for hypercomplexity? They came up with soft skills. And whether it's Deloitte and Touche, KPMG, World Economic Forum, Cisco did a study last year, and I think it was 17 industrial sectors in 7 or 8 Asian countries. It was in partnership with the World Economic Forum. And they said there's only one way for countries and companies to deal with the escalating artificial intelligence, automation, robotics revolution in a context of hyper change. That's not more technology. It's soft skills.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've done at Ubiquity University, we've got a foundation in soft skills course. We did an analysis of all the studies that have been done, and you can distill them down to about 7. One is mindfulness and embodiment, just learning to be quiet with yourself and being embodied. Understand that we're embodied beings. What's your nutrition? How are you exercising? What is your life habits? Because we begin and end in our bodies. The second soft skill is cross-boundary team building. The more diversity we have, the more creative we can be. But diversity, as we've just seen in the United States and all around the world, if it's not schooled properly, leads to conflict. Racism is basically an inability to deal with diversity. How do we enhance the culture of cross-boundary team building? If you can harness that, your creativity is almost boundless. The third one is innovation and entrepreneurship as a mindset. And clearly, Lucretia, you mastered that at a very early age, and off you went. Because you got it in your mind. It was a mindset. And you've produced this extraordinary company. And then fourthly is emotional intelligence, which may be the most important. And that goes back to mindfulness. How do we, in a world, and let me take a moment on this because I'd like to just emphasize this pandemic, what Trump is doing in the United States, for example, what's happening all over the world is like this huge centrifugal force that's making it harder and harder to concentrate, harder and harder to keep coherence, And it's generating more and more emotional outrage, disintegration. So how you modulate your emotions, you know, if your boss is critical to you, does it take you 3 minutes to get over it, or does it take you 3 months? How do you calibrate for an increasingly emotionally stressed environment? So learning emotional intelligence is unbelievably critical. And that connects to heart coherence, which is the center of your emotions. And then fifthly is critical thinking. You know, there's hardly a school in the United States that's teaching critical thinking. It may be the most important course out there in a world of fake news. And as Patrick has been emphasizing, basically we've been commodified.
Right.
And how do we understand the difference between all the input that is coming our way on a daily basis? And then leadership, the sixth one, leadership. And it's not just leading the group, it's leading yourself. How do you develop life competencies that will enable you to maintain your equilibrium and draw out from yourself the potential that is there? And then fifth and finally is whole system design. You got to understand that yourself from the perspective of the whole, and you need to understand how all the parts work. And we just had a panel yesterday, which by design drew 4 people who were completely different from one another in 4 different silos. And the challenge was connecting the dots, and it turned out beautifully. It was a beautiful, beautiful panel. But that notion of whole system design as the seventh of the soft skills, so that would be, I think, from the Ubiquity point of view, the teaching of soft skills, which at the heart is enhancing your personal potential and your personal self-esteem, is key to the navigation of hypercomplexity. Because in hypercomplexity, it's not what you know. You can get that from the iPhone. It's who you are.
Exactly.
It's how well you play with others. It's how coherent you are in a rising sea of chaos. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, and I don't know whether anybody has any comments on that, but that strikes us at Ubiquity as a seminally important offering that we have through a course called Foundations in Soft Skills that we're actually rolling out in Asia right now, in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Pakistan, and India, through governments and the corporate sector, because there's been studies that show no matter where you are in the world, no matter what industrial sector you work in, everybody needs soft skills the same. And it doesn't matter whether you're in grammar school, high school, university, or you're already in the workplace. Everybody needs to learn soft skills.
Jim, I think, you know, your comments are extraordinarily powerful, and they underscore the deep rootedness of the old story. And you and I have had this conversation before. Even its name is pejorative. The hard skills matter. The science, the technology, you name it, the stuff that gets you into another place on a linear educational ladder. The soft skills are the most fundamental, the most essential, and yet we have the audacity to call them soft as if they were secondary and don't really matter. When I was where I started hearing you, and I love the list of what you've named as those essential skills. Sherry Turkle is very renowned in, I'm sure Patrick and Lucretia know her work in technology and psychology. And she tells a very powerful story in her last book about convening conversations, in which she has a group of PhD interns working with her. And they have developed a phenomenal robot for nursing homes. And this one woman had just lost her son, and she had become completely non-communicative. And the people in the nursing home were very, very troubled. So they asked Sherry to work with her graduate students, and they worked on this robot, and they are standing behind a glass mirror, so she cannot see them, but maybe there are 15 students and Sherry. And she said the robot comes into the room, and Patrick would know this much better, I think, than because Patrick, I love your construct of let's root it in caring. Let's start there. But the robot comes into the room, and it's called an empathetic robot. And so it comes near the woman, and it reaches out its hand, and it sort of touches her hand and strokes it. And then she starts, moves its head, and it makes noises like, and the woman starts talking. And the robot is just acting as if it's hearing and listening and responding. And Sherry said, when that happened, the students erupted in cheers and applause and high five one another. And she said, and she felt horrible. She said it was the most stunning, horrible moment of her life. She said, here we are, 20 human beings watching a robot when we should have gone out from behind the glass to hug her. And that's what when Patrick talks, Patrick, that's what I hear you saying. Let us not forget, we have become so dazzled by some of this technology that we have completely subjugated our own humanity. Never mind caring, it's quintessentially who we are. And we think we're doing something good. And it's devolving all of us. And so, you spurred that in me, that stunning story. I remember her telling it, and then it's in her last book too.
You're right. I mean, the Ricochet actually captures this in Super Sema, right? You can't outsource compassion and care to technology. And in fact, it's only through, yes, a new future, but I do think we can learn a lot from what I call timeless wisdom. People call it ancient wisdom or indigenous wisdom. I call it timeless wisdom that needs to be respected and integrated, as well as, more integration of the elderly in our society to be teachers and mentors. And I think we've lost that. We're outsourcing a lot of that human connection and learning to technology, which is a mistake. So how do we create a system that both inspires people, through the use of technology for scale, but has a real human heart at the center? And importantly, the people that are involved in it need to be trained so they can authentically transmit the intention. So one of the things that I talk to our team about a lot is, we can't intend to do good in the world if we're not working also on our own personal growth, right? And so how do you create in your own home a microcosm of the good you want to see through how you treat your pet and how you treat, the environment, the choices you make with regard to your family and your children. And, in doing so, you embody it, then it becomes more natural for you to then bring that into the workplace and bring that into the technology that you build. And so if people aren't taught this, then how can they build technology that drives forward some level of empathy if they aren't empathetic or taught that or have done that work themselves? So that's really, really important. I think if we don't get this generation right to build that sort of empathy and compassion into the learning process, then the people that build the technology of the future won't build it into it because they don't personally know it or they don't appreciate it. And that's a real risk. I think we're already seeing that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think just to close on that, I'm a great fan of technology. I think it really enhances, teachers. It helps in classrooms. It can really help learning. The one thing when it comes especially to soft skills that I think, there's, we obviously integrate soft skills in the stories we tell and characters. But I think one of the things we're noticing is with schools being closed, really this pandemic, the one most affected sector is education, and even technology has not been able to solve that. Why? Because for kids, especially 1 hour on Zoom every day, doesn't do it. You need the physical interaction. You need a teacher who's there for you, who's caring, who's loving, who's a human being. Sure, helped by apps and videos, and I'm in this sector, so I'm all in for that. But I think it being in the same classroom, even having the little misunderstandings with fellow students, and who raises the hands and speaking over each other, and getting in fights, and that's all part of learning, and that's how you develop soft skills. And if you don't have that, then we're going to become robots. So my big question out there is technology helps to really democratize education and really make it scalable, and it has so many benefits, but I don't think there's going to be something that substitutes getting into a physical space with other people and talking to each other and looking at each other and learning together. So how can we maintain that in an ever-changing world full of technology and full of pandemics and who knows what's next? That's a question I don't have the answer to, but I know it's fundamental to preserve that kind of human interaction.
I'm just curious for both of you, if you have any conversations with professional educators or people that are wanting to be educators. Are you thinking about developing experiences for them? Because you can use technology in a quote linear system, which is what we have in education right now. It's very easy to deliver the current curriculum, or easier through technology in remote learning than it is to create the kinds of, and I went to your website, Lucretia. I love what I saw. It was just so joyful. I mean, I really felt joy. So to create that, yes, of course you can do it with technology. It's much more difficult than just delivering the curriculum, which is what most kids are getting now in remote learning and teachers are doing now in remote learning. It's not engaging them. It's checking off the boxes. Okay, they did this assignment. Okay, they did that lesson. So the challenge is to take the generative applications of technology and create the fundamentally different container for wise problem solving and engaged learning and collaborative learning. And I haven't seen a lot of that in a formal way. Most of what we have been seeing is technology developing supplemental activities for children, but it's not part of the system. But now we have to say, all right, what does that mean for the system? And then we have to have the system's quote teachers understanding that and being trained in the same kind of way.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm actually quite encouraged by the, at least in the UK, definitely here in Portugal, a lot more investment at the very young level into forest schools.
Yes.
And
yes.
leaning into nature as a teacher.
Yes.
I'm really impressed by that. I mean, much more than I ever had as a kid. The choices are very, very broad. And I think that's another thing, talking about learning from the past or learning from the ever present, with nature as a great teacher on how to create a system that actually is in itself generative and inclusive, right? I think that's something that I am quite encouraged about. And I'm also encouraged by how the younger generation is actually demanding authenticity and truth. Generation Z, as they call them, that's one of the key characteristics, actually. And so I find it to be, our obligation, moral obligation on all of our parts to kind of listen to that and build that into our systems. But nature as a teacher is one that I think is something that we have, again, a narrow window to preserve that nature and even increase it so that it can be an important part of the growth of a human being, because time in nature is in itself so healing and so much of a way to encourage, greater care at the heart.
And to Stephanie's point about introducing this in a more formal setting, Patrick and I had a brief chat yesterday, and we're just, we're both so focusing more on the consumer side and informal learning, so parents and kids going directly to them. And I've decided to go that route because it's so hard to go through schools and teachers, and there's so many levels of institutions and governments that, as an entrepreneur, motivated by a mission, and the best way to do that is to build a company around it, is just not viable. I mean, it's too hard, and there are so many complexity levels. So we're just like, let's go this other route and make that great. And as soon as there's an opportunity, to make an impact, to have an impact on a formal level, of course, we're going to jump on it. But it's not, and I've gone that route. When we started, just a brief example and story, when we started building the apps for schools, for literacy and numeracy, we built those apps to go in schools to help teachers and kids. And guess what? In Africa, in Nairobi, there were 2 million tablets sitting around with no content. And we went to the ministry and to institutions and said, we have 2 years of curriculum that teaches literacy and numeracy. It's matched to your curriculum. It's all African with African characters. I mean, it was so spot on, and it's free. Get it, use it. It was never uploaded on these tablets. The tablets were still sitting around, and that's when we decided to go directly to smartphones, because in Africa, almost 50% of parents have these low-income smartphones that support our games. So we decided to change everything and just go directly through them. At least the kids can use these apps at home and practice and do their homework with it, and that for us was easier. So that's, but I'd love, that was my original mission, because that's the heart of learning. But with that not being possible, that's what we can focus on right now.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Catherine Alexander asked a question to you all that's very relevant to this juncture. Are we creating kids that can tend a computer but not a plant? Will they move so fast that waiting for grass to grow is painful? You touched on that, Patrick, but I think that's a domain we should just fill out just a little bit. It's this whole phenomenon of nature deficit disorder.
Yes.
Kids, go into supermarkets and they don't know that steak comes from a cow. They don't know that eggs come from chickens. They just buy products with no sense of, that seventh of the soft skills, whole system design. They don't know where things fit, and they have no sense of nature. So I'd love to hear, maybe Lucretia, what do you, with your phenomenal system, how are you dealing with the nature deficit disorder that's increasingly plaguing young people everywhere in a human population where I think something like 70% of the people are now in major urban areas and megalopolises of 10, 20, 30 million people?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly the question, I think, all great technologies and technology solutions are human-centered and are inspired by humans and nature and real problems in the real world. That's how we went about creating anything. It's always, revolving around problems that we see on the ground in schools with kids, and that's how we build technology around it. And I think that kids should grow up with that same approach towards technology. So understanding that they can handle a computer, but it should also be anything they create that's tech. It must be rooted within the real world and nature and society. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just just wanting to underscore the importance in this discussion of the future of learning, that nature needs to be the teacher. I mean, that I put it more.
Yeah.
succinctly that the task of the human race right now is to learn biomimicry.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
actually, I was just
Every
about
level.
to say, we
Right.
have an entire Super Sema episode on biomimicry. And it's all
There you go.
about Super Sema. And so basically the storyline is the robot is polluting the world with his super jet, and Super Sema comes up with these incredible albatross inspired wings that are that don't pollute, and there's a whole mission, and she has all these other biomimicry gadgets. So we're telling these type of stories for Super Sema about biomimicry, and I think even more than that is also we hope that all these episodes inspire kids to get off their computers and try build these things in the real world, go out and play, and every episode has a mission, so we hope they can go on these missions in the real world and play outside and all of that. So I mean, that's how we're trying to address that in what we do.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, one of the secrets of Silicon Valley is that many of the people who work for these tech companies and the CEOs, they limit the technology usage in their own homes. They turn their screens black and white to not be drawn by the attractiveness of the addictive tech. Steve Jobs has some famous quotes about, how he limited technology in the home. I personally, made a point and make a point on a regular basis of turning off our phones, spending time in places that have no mobile reception, even with our children, spending time slowing down a little bit. And you're working against, again, some pretty serious headwinds, right? I mean, all the incredible things that are constantly at our fingertips. So it does take, though, parents, particularly in the home, forget schools, being mindful enough that they're teaching this behavior through their own actions and not using technology as a babysitter early, as easy as that is and as helpful as that can be. But for them to be the example and set the example, even as hard as that is. And so this is another reason why, this care-based learning mindset is super important, particularly care for self, others, and the world, called the care triangle, is because over time, if you learn enough about yourself, if you learn enough about how to be in great relationship with others, and if you learn enough about the world, you'll learn that there's a deep interconnectivity between the three, and you can't have anyone without the other two being inherently part of that story. So that's another thing that we need to really focus on in our learning is, isn't just about personal growth and personal success, isn't just about having great relationships, which can help serve your own personal growth and you can serve others, but is every single thing we do in our understanding of nature and our relationship with nature something that literally could last in our behavior with it another 100 or 1,000 years, so that we can benefit from the bounty that we've been given, that we have unfortunately through the systems that we've created taken for granted for way too long. This is why I think technology, entertainment, and fast-moving changes to existing school systems are critical, because we don't have time, literally don't have time, to work through the existing school systems for this information to be transmitted quickly enough for the change that we need to happen. Because I think, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that our current model is unsustainable, and even if you take it a bit further, self-terminating.
I do. Patrick, I'm glad you mentioned the forest schools, because it's the kids are actually out in the forest. I mean, they are living in, experiencing, breathing, playing with, digging up dirt, planting gardens, all kinds of things. But I want to come back, Jim, to what you said about the soft skills, because the turbulence and I'll use the words turbulence and frenzy that is happening in our culture, and it's mimicked in schools. It didn't start there. I mean, it starts because we've created a narrative of economic competition and capital and numbers of things that translate into, well, the model of schooling and the mental model has to mimic the way the culture works. And so, I'm in a lot of networks where we're in conversation about where is the silence in places called schools or learning. But let's say, where is the opportunity for silence? Where is the opportunity for reflection? Where is the opportunity? You started off when you talked about soft skills, meditation. The Heart Mind Institute the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Sustainability, that there we are, we have to focus, and I know Patrick and Lucretia are, to your credit, guys, it's remarkable work you're doing. The internal journey is not part of the external mind development, and that's a huge chasm. We are so bifurcated, our children are so bifurcated, that we have to create conditions in every environment, but certainly where we ostensibly say this is where the minds and hearts of our children are shaped to a significant degree, that there are safe places for silence and quiet and reflection, where kids can get out of the noise because they don't know how to. Neither can their parents, mostly, especially now.
Yeah. Well, I think with climate change spinning out of control now, and our indicators, most of which are in the environment, if you think of the indicators that may do us in, as Patrick just said, as a possibility, they're all coming from the environment. I mean, just think of the accelerating rate of species extinction. Think of the massive deforestation, the water scarcity,
Right.
the pollution in the ocean, the increasing plastic in the ocean, the pollution of the air, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. And one of the panels over the last few days, one of the panelists was the proud father of a baby girl. And one of the other panelists said, the tragedy is that little baby of yours has probably 500 to 700 chemicals in her little body, endocrine disrupting chemicals that weren't in human bodies 75 years ago. Every baby out there now is being born, in a sense, polluted. And so how we reconnect not only with nature, but a despoiled nature that we have to, and this is another point that keeps coming up that I'd love your comment on in terms of learning. There's the point that's being made is no longer sufficient to live sustainably with the earth. The earth has now become so deconstructed and polluted. We now have to engage in regenerative economics.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to engage in a renewal, not only of the human spirit,
Right.
but of the earth herself.
Right.
In fact, we're going to be doing a major 7-day program between the 23rd and the 29th of July, starting this next Thursday, on regenerative economics, on what Kate Rayworth calls donut economics, where you put human well-being in the center within the context of the larger outer ring of ecological systems and constraints. So the challenge of the human race is, and this is why I raised the issue of nature. Nature is the context, ladies and gentlemen. It's not your city. It's not your company. Nature is the context. And not unless and until we get that nature is the context, nature is the community. We are nature. We are the environment. This conversation is nature speaking it to itself.
Exactly.
I mean, think that thought. And how does learning, how does learning need to accentuate this? So I'd like to hear from each of you, maybe starting in reverse order, Lucretia, and then Patrick, and then Stephanie. Then we'll draw our session to a close here. How does learning lead us back to the mother?
Yeah. I think as I touched on before, it is very important for children growing up to understand that everything they learn has a bigger purpose, has a purpose for the world and that we live in. And I think that when we grow up with that sense and how important that is, then everything we do will be about caring for the world we live in and the people that inhabit the world, as opposed to learning just for the sake of doing it because the teacher is telling us that we need to understand this. When we understand that every single thing that we learn has a bigger purpose and scope for our lives, then I think we will all be more caring for the environment and everything around us, because we will all see how we fit into this bigger purpose. And I think all the things we touched upon, from soft skills to everything, really help that, so we can grow up humans with a sense of everything, not just reading, writing, and math, but really what their place in the world is, and how they can make it better, and how they are ultimately responsible for caring for it.
Thank you. Patrick.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. One thing person that's been a real inspiration to me, my wife is a master herbalist, and she's trained in use of plants and as a naturopath to find holistic ways to heal people. And it's interesting because I had in spending time with her and spending time with her in nature and observing her work and just kind of feeding off of the knowledge that she's been gaining as well, I realized, how in our society, we take a similar approach to sort of orthodox medicine when we have a problem, right? Orthodox medicine sees that there's a problem. They come up with something that deals with the specific problem, but it doesn't go to the root of the problem, right? It goes to solving that particular problem, right? You have a headache, here's a pill to get rid of the headache. It doesn't go to the root cause of why do you have a headache? And this is a concern when it comes to society as a whole. So we have a problem with an earth that's becoming increasingly polluted, perhaps inhospitable. So technology provides the pill. Let's go colonize Mars. Let's find ways to spray, things into the atmosphere to, reduce, carbon, all these sort of technological solutions, as opposed to going back to basics like a naturopath for our society and saying, let's just step back and think about, what are we putting into our bodies? What are we putting into our bodies, both physically through what we eat, and what are we putting into our bodies mentally through the media that we consume? Is the media that we consume, is the pace with which, we operate, and the negativity and fear that's put into our society through leaders who have ulterior motives, or through media for the sake of a quick buck through advertising because it's attractive and lowest common denominator. Is this actually causing great harm? And I think we could probably agree that it is to some extent. And so, nature is an important part of this solution, because the more we spend time in nature, away from these attractive entertainment channels, or the news cycle, or the latest, crazy story that's coming from the press, the more we immerse ourselves in nature, the more that we spend time listening to the sounds of nature and each other in that space, we can't help but love it. You can't help but want to protect it. And this is something, I had the great fortune of meeting Sir David Attenborough recently, and he said, this is now his life mission is just to get people to recognize that, you can't spend time in nature and see and witness the beauty of nature and not want to then protect it. And so, yes, I think it's at the core, and observing how nature heals itself through balance is a great lesson for us all. How do we get back to a holistic approach to learning that takes into account the causes for the problems we're trying to solve, not just getting greater economic output, or getting people into better schools, or getting people to do new things that will cost less. I think it takes a whole new paradigm shift that we need to engage in, and how we get there is the big question. But I'm for one committed to that change, and I look forward to working with other allies in that fight.
Beautifully put. Thank you.
Yeah, was beautifully put by both of them. Well, Jim, you know that I have spent decades using living systems as a metaphor for the redesign of learning systems. And so I go back, we've talked about biomimicry, but it goes beyond that. It's how does nature do it? And I've always been drawn to the construct of aspen grove, the idea of an aspen grove. In Utah, the largest one is 80,000 individual trees, one root system. So that notion of what is the root, root system of the natural world, and how does that translate into the root system? I mean, cognition is the process of life. I mean, so learning is the process of life. So there is an inextricable connection between how nature works and how learning environments work. So what is a living system? It's an open system. It exchanges information with its environment. It builds on relationships, and they're collaborative and communicative, and it changes through emergence, but only if certain conditions are in place to make it more likely that that will happen. And then structures and processes and patterns will emerge. We need to step back to really understand the mother, as you said, to say, how does she work? And design human systems, which are really cognitive, natural systems, to work as she does. And life is, I started my comments by saying, life as our mentor.
Mm. Mm. Well, thank you, Lucretia. Thank you. You're so bright and
Young.
passionate. I wish you all the best with Kukoa. And I invite everybody to go on her website, as Stephanie said. When you go to the Kukoa website, you'll feel joy.
Yep.
Well done, Lucretia. You're just so heartwarming to see young people like you out there just doing it. And Patrick, you know, your extraordinary sagacity today and awareness, you know, as a CEO of and effectively in a tech company, of the importance of nature and the importance of disengaging from technology, and the importance of an equanimity in one's life within the context of which technology serves rather than enslaves. That's just a beautiful thing to see you embody. So I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for everything you folks at Uptime are doing. And then Stephanie's an elder. She's been a mentor to me since the day I met her. And she actually, just to say something about Stephanie, she did something that I don't know of anybody else that's really pulled off. You know, it's one thing to talk about these things in kind of conventional life, but to take transformational learning and embed it in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, you know, the hard skills, and to do it, you know, 50 years ago at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, and to do it in such an effective, extraordinary way that she became essentially a legend in the educational circles in the United States, is no mean feat. So I just want to acknowledge you, Stephanie, as an elder, you know, in this conversation and in the world of learning. This has been such a scintillating and profound dialogue today, and I really want to thank you all for it. And I want to just close with a comment that Carlos Prosser made in one of the chats. He said, "For years, I have trained thousands of teachers in pedagogical innovation and environmental education. And we have really had extraordinary results. When the teacher changes, education changes. And when we work with the idea of a learning community, we all learn, both the teachers and the students." And I think that's a good closing note, you know, is that not only is education being radically transformed, but we're all in the school now. All of us are being hit by the pandemic, for example. We're all learning. So whether you're 85 years old or you're 5 years old, we're all in the same school now. And it's our capacity as a human community, I think, to embrace the soft skills, to embrace transformational learning, you know, not only K through 12, but university, and then for the rest of our lives. That's really, I think, the invitation and the challenge of learning as we face the future, cushioned by our reconnection with the forest. with nature. So thank you all. This has been marvelous. And tomorrow we're going to meet again for day 62. And we're going to delve into transpersonal learning. How do we engage in the transformation, not just at our personal level, but at the community level and at the personal, communal, and ecological levels at the same time? At the same time. And we're going to be hearing from some people that are very active in EUROTAS, which is the European Association of Integral Transpersonal Psychology. It's going to be convened by a splendid, brilliant French woman, Bernadette Blin, who was the 2019 president of EUROTAS, and has put that panel together. Because just thinking, if we are the children of the earth, our individuality, our community, the human species, and all species are in the same classroom.
Right. Right.
We're in the same conversation.
Yep.
And so how do we begin to extend our awareness, not only to the community of people, but through the larger ecosystem of sentient life?
Right.
That's a question worth pondering. And tomorrow we'll be picking up that strand. So thank you, everyone. Love this conversation today. I just loved it. We'll see you all again tomorrow. Same time, same station, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time.
Great work. Thanks, Jim.
Bye. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Nailed it, Jim.
That was a good one.
Yeah, glad you liked it. That was,
Loved it, Patrick. Thank you so much. It was just, I've so enjoyed getting